Hi, everyone.
Hello.
It's nice to get some response. Thank you all for coming today. It's nice to see a full house. So we're at the possibly the last one of our ICT and development seminar series for this term. Some of you, I think, have been to some of the previous ones, so I just wanted to remind you all that you can get a lot of them online. There's webcasts of them all. If you go to the Oxford Internet Institute webcast site, you'll be able to see any of the ones that you've missed if you haven't been at some of the previous ones. So for our final one of these this year, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Padraig Carmody. And so Padraig, he once very kindly let me stay with him in Dublin when I first moved to work with him at Trinity College. And I was going to start his introduction.
The telly, was it?
Yeah, I was going
ICT?
to. Well, no, I was going to start this introduction with the story about how I almost got him in trouble with the law by ordering illegal contraband into his house.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave that story for the drinks reception afterwards, and I think this is a good moment for me to remind you all that we have a drinks reception afterwards. So after the talk, we'll have some wine and snacks outside. And we're also going to take Padraig for dinner afterwards, so any of you are welcome to join. If you are interested, just come and chat with me, and we'll figure out how many people want to go. But back to Padraig. So Padraig's work has been really quite influential in the fields of development geography and African studies, and of course ICT and development. He is an associate professor in the geography department at Trinity College Dublin. He directs the Trinity Master's Program in Development Practice. He's the editor-in-chief of the journal Geoforum. He's written extensively about information, communication, technology, and the ways in which those things intersect and interact with economic geographies and inequality and poverty in the African context. And his latest book is called Africa's Information Revolution. And I know both myself and a lot of colleagues here are quite eager to get a copy of it. So today, Padraig will be speaking about that exact same topic, so please just join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for the invite to be here. So as Mark was saying, I'm going to be talking to you about this forthcoming book. It'll be coming out in the next month or so, co-authored with Jim Murphy of Clark University in the US. The premise of the project is that it will be small and medium-sized enterprises which will drive economic development in Africa. Not big transnational corporations for the most part. We know about the extractive nature of Africa's economic relations and the role that big oil and other resource transnationals have played in that. So you're interested in finding out how is it that ICTs are deployed by small and medium-sized enterprises in one manufacturing and one service sector in two countries, so to give us that comparative basis. So I'll talk more about this. This is the flyer for the book. If anybody is interested, I'll email Mark when I get back to Dublin. There's a discount code, so you can get 20% off if anybody is interested in it. Okay, so just a few background facts and figures. You're probably familiar with much of this. Okay, so Africa now has about 700 million mobile phone subscriptions. We've gone from what Manuel Castells talked about supposedly as a black hole of informational capitalism to now Africa leapfrogging the developed countries supposedly in terms of connectivity and ICTs. Well, what are the impacts of this in terms of the structure of the economy and the developmental impacts? Some countries have a higher than 100% penetration rate. In Ghana and South Africa, for example. So why would you have more than 100% penetration? Why is there more mobile phones or more SIM cards than there are?
Because they've got two.
They've got two. Why do they have two?
The network.
The network charges. Okay, so if you're calling off network, it's more expensive, so you have to have two phones or maybe three phones. Okay. It's the fastest growing market for mobile phones in the world. Again, you probably know that. But according to Nigel Thrift, who is a very influential geographer, he says information technology is both more and less important than is often thought. It's more important because, in a sense, it's become routinized. We all look at screens most of our days, or many of us. We're tapping away on computers, or we're looking at our mobile phone screens, or whatever it is. But we don't really think about what it is that we're doing. It's just become routinized for us. But it's more important than that. But then he also says it's less important in the sense that, does it fundamentally change the nature of your economy and society? What are the structural implications of ICTs? So you need to interrogate these questions critically, analytically, empirically, in order to get to the impacts of these technologies. And this is what our project seeks to do. If you read a lot of the kind of boosterous literature in the media, or you watch Bloomberg TV, Innovate Africa, and so on, these are meant to be revolutionary, transformative technologies, which are decreasing Africa's marginalization in the global economy. Is that actually the case? Well, as I mentioned, we investigated this by looking at the impact specifically on the wood product sector, mostly furniture, and tourism. Okay? So drilling down into small and medium-sized enterprises, finding out exactly how their production processes, routines, practices, innovation, policies, and so on are being affected by these. 200 firm-level interviews in Durban and Cape Town for tourism, Durban for wood products, and Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. Zanzibar, again, a major tourism centre, and Dar es Salaam, the biggest city in Tanzania with a major wood products and furniture manufacturing sector. Okay, what does this photo conjure up for you? $2.5 million smartphone. What associations does that conjure up for you, if any? You look like you're going to say something.
I mean, just a status symbol, but in
Okay.
a very perverse way.
Okay, so it's a diamond-encrusted mobile phone, so it's a positional good, right? You're showing that you're wealthier than other people. Okay, anything else about how this was produced, or?
For Middle East, maybe.
Okay, you think maybe from the Middle East? Okay, so maybe for the Middle Eastern market, we don't know who owned this. Where did these come from, most likely? The diamonds, mostly from Africa, probably cut and polished in India, okay? Think about the coltan, the columbite tantalite, which may have come from Democratic Republic of Congo or whatever. So for certain people, this displays power, prestige, wealth. For other people who are involved in producing this, maybe it's associated with exploitative labor conditions, maybe with conflict and so on. So it's important to think about the entire commodity chain and how people are inserted into these technologies in different ways, and how it has different meanings and social ramifications and impacts depending on your positionality. Some of you may have seen these before. This is one way of getting around the high network, off-network charges, right, dual SIM card phone. And again, there's been quite a lot of literature talking about the different types of technological innovations in Africa, and the fact that people have social innovations such as flashing or beeping, which is kind of a Morse code where you don't connect and you don't incur the call charges, but you're able to communicate with someone across distance using this, using the rings on the phone as a kind of code. Okay? All right. Now, there are some big mobile phone companies that have come out of Africa. The most notable one of those is Mobile Telecommunications Networks out of South Africa, which has 26% of the African market. You can see they're also operating in some other countries in Asia. But it's out of South Africa. And I was at a conference a few years ago in Manchester, and Joseph Stiglitz said, these big mobile phone companies, Vodafone, Vodacom, NTN, they are mining poorer countries of income. So this is, in a sense, replicating a kind of colonial division of labour, where South Africa serves as the core, the regional core, and income is being extracted. So you have Tanzanian peasants loading up credit onto their mobile phones, and it ends up in the pockets of people the people in India who own Bharti, Airtel, or other billionaires sometime, okay? Mo Ibrahim, and you know some of the others, okay? So we need to think as well about the flows of value of these mobile phone credit chains, if you like, and we can talk about some of the governance implications of this. But this is, again, kind of replicating patterns of uneven development, even if there are developmental benefits, and some of these big companies are some of the biggest taxpayers. So again, kind of dialectical impact. Now, if you read the World Bank literature, or some of the World Bank literature on this topic, mobile telephony is meant to be a kind of silver or magic bullet. Right? You can see here, this is a recent 2012 report. Mobile money, M-Pesa being the kind of iconic example of that. Okay. Does transferring money from one place to another transform your economy? Okay, women's empowerment. Again, agriculture, M-agriculture, M-health, all of these different things, right? But the picture you're getting here, right, is that this is meant to be, in terms of the discourse there, a fundamentally transformative technology in terms of gender relations, in terms of economic development, in terms of social service provision, and so on. Okay? So again, is this really the case? Can we load as much meaning or potential onto these devices as is often done in much of the kind of literature on this? Okay. Now, there has been some critical literature as well. Tom Maloney in Edinburgh, he did studies where he found, for example, that far from empowering farmers, that traders in Tanzania could use their position as suppliers of credit to lock farmers into forward contracts. So just having a mobile phone didn't change the socioeconomic power relationship, right? There's a much broader structure of power inequality that the mobile phone can actually serve to feed into and reinforce, right? So again, we need to be cautious about attributing independent causative power to these technologies. If you look at some of the expenditure surveys, you find that people are spending very high proportions of their income on putting credit on their phones. So for example, in South Africa, respondents on average spend 10 to 15% of their incomes on their mobile phones. Some countries in Ethiopia and Tanzania, it's more than that. It can be up to a third, maybe, a quarter or a third for some people. Now, why would you do that? I mean, many of us don't know how much we spend on our mobile phones. Maybe it's 1% or less. We don't really pay attention to it. But why would you spend a third of your income? Is it to reduce poverty? Is it to reduce your poverty? Or is there some other structural dynamic at play?
It's to save on bus fares.
It's
Spending time travelling to the nearest town can take a lot of money and time compared to just a phone call.
Okay. So there's this time-saving feature which has gotten a lot of play. But one of the things we argue in the book is that there's a phenomenon of negative adoption. This is where people will choose to not pay their kids' school fees and to buy mobile phone credit. Or they'll choose not to buy tea or sugar or other consumption items and to load up their mobile phone with credit. And they're forced to do that because of the imperative of remaining and connecting to broader networks of social support and employment opportunity. So to be disconnected from the network is so disadvantageous that people are forced into this kind of Faustian bargain or choice, if you like, where they have to. They're almost compelled by the structural forces at play to spend money on things that they wouldn't necessarily willingly do. So again, it's not just about freedom and empowerment and ICTs flattening out borders or breaking down borders. They're embedded in broader structures of socioeconomic inequality and power. Some other research, some qualitative quotes. This was Catherine Diga from a survey in Uganda. Mobile phones bring poverty. Again, quite different from what we're used to getting in the literature or on the media. When I interviewed a township tourist guest house owner in Cape Town, they said the cost of the mobile phone is killing, but they didn't feel that they could not have that technology. They needed for customers to be able to ring them. Okay? So again, some of the same kinds of ideas that I've been talking about previously, so this idea of negative adoption. Now, for thinking about it analytically, some social theorists and geographers have drawn a distinction between what is imminent development or will development, the idea that through planning and will we can overcome end poverty, right? Through the World Bank or whatever it is, or DFID or other NGOs or whatever it might be, okay? Versus imminent development, which is the idea that the global capitalist market economy has its own laws of motion, including those around technology, patterns of uneven development, and long waves of technology development and all of these other kinds of things, right, which are not subject to control by governments or by particular institutions. Okay? They have their own laws of motion. And much of the literature, we argue, on ICTs has fallen into this category. The idea that ICTs can end poverty through some of the applications that I've been talking to you about, but without thinking so much about how ICTs articulate with and shape imminent development, the broader patterns and rhythms of the socio-economy and its uneven unfolding and globalization. This is a graph from a paper there you see, Wazalowski et al. 2012, just comparing age of mobile phone users. In the red, they own the mobile phone. The yellow, they're non-owners, but they're still users, okay? So you see there generally that they tend to be younger, up to about 40 years of age, right, then it drops off, but in the teenage years there, more of them don't own them, okay? Years of education, you can see again here some patterns there, so people with 1 year of education, numbers of individuals there, so that's about 5,000 people there in the survey, okay? And then people with more income, well, it's kind of bifurcated there. You see these kind of twin peaks there, right? So more upper income people certainly use these technologies, and then the non-owners are concentrated in the lower income kind of categories there, okay? So these technologies are classed, they're raced, they are gendered in terms of their use, their application, and we need to pay attention to social differentiation and uneven adoption and use of these technologies. Okay. So in the book, what our starting point is that economic development is about the coming together of a whole complex of factors. It's around infrastructure, it's around macroeconomic strategy and industrial policy, it's around capabilities, it's around global institutions, trade and capital regimes, and a whole variety of things, not just information and communication technologies, or even if they can be important. So in terms of conceptualizing the impacts of ICTs, we develop or we merge three different kinds of theories. Theories of the firm, then socio-technical regime theory, or the multi-level perspective, which talks about things like cultures, norms, belief systems, values in relation to consumption, ideologies, structural ties to the world system, and so on. Okay, so in the industrial regimes here, you have workers, SMEs that import technologies, input suppliers, civil societies, and then SMEs that manufacture or provide a service. And then in a lot of the recent economic geography literature, there has been a lot of attention over the last decade or so to something called global production networks. And the idea of regional globalized development, that if a region wants to develop, it has to attract investment from these global production networks to the region and establish a strategic coupling between the region and these global production networks, okay? All sounds very good. But there's also what we call inward GPNs. That is, ICTs also facilitate imports into the economy. They may not just facilitate firms connecting outwards to the global economy, they also make it much easier to import into Tanzania, importing sofas or tables from China or whatever it is. Okay? So this is inward GPN couplings as well as potentially outward GPN couplings. Right? And which is more important? If you have an underdeveloped industrial sector, or if you have an unstable macroeconomy, which is likely, more likely to dominate. All right, just another kind of schematic around this. So again, there you see the ICTs and the GPN coupling, socio-technical regimes, global production networks, and are ICTs helping to reposition African firms and industries in relation to global production networks? And part of the answer to that depends on the impacts on the socio-technical regime. That is, are they facilitating new institutions, process and product innovation, which will allow or facilitate that strategic coupling between the socio-technical regime or the industrial regime and the global production networks. Okay. And we develop a couple of concepts to try and think this through. And we can think, one of these concepts is the idea of thin integration into the global informational economy. And you can think of this operating across a variety of different scales. You can think of it at the macro scale. So this is what I'm doing here, is tracing through the dimensions of thin integration in terms of the ICT value chain itself. So if you think of the primary way in which Africa is integrated, or most African countries are integrated into ICT value chains, what is it? What's the primary way in which most African countries are integrated into ICT value chains?
Primary commodity export.
Commodity, okay, so 3/4 of what sub-Saharan Africa exports is primary commodities, right? But in a sense, the counterflow to that is imports of ICT and other manufactured goods, right? So the money, the foreign exchange, comes from exports of raw materials, primary commodities, and the counterflow is manufactured goods, many of which are base transceiver stations, mobile phones, and all of the other technologies. Billions of dollars a year being imported. And you can think of that as a form of capital leakage. That is money which could be deployed to other uses. There's an opportunity cost to that $20 billion that's spent on imports of these things. Okay? Would it be better invested in machine tools to set up productive factories, for example? And there are many, many other examples you could think of like that. Okay, so exports of columbite tantalite, say from the Democratic Republic of Congo, to produce capacitators to enable ICTs to function. Value addition and processing takes place overseas. Imports of mobile phones, components for regional assembly, imports of base transceiver stations, capital drain, capital extraction results in underinvestment in skills, infrastructure, institutions, research and development, and so on. Foreign ownership of ICT service provision, flows of capital overseas, right? Often flow of income from the informal to the formal sector, globalizing this functional dualism. So whereas global capitalism may have not been able to engage in surplus extraction from the informal sector in Africa directly, this offers a channel or an axis through which that can be achieved. Right? Because some of the biggest users, as we saw, work in the informal sector. Socially, articulating domestically and regionally. So yes, connecting people up more with their families. There's some recent research that shows these technologies are heavily used for security purposes. But paradoxically, this intensifies local and regional social relations rather than the kind of globalized economic development that we might expect or that we hear a lot about in the literature. And then finally, absence of territorial innovation systems. If you want to have a knowledge economy, you have to have a territorial innovation system where you're developing new technologies, capturing the rents from them, and then reinvesting them in further technological development. But there aren't really developed technological innovation systems or territorial innovation systems across much of the continent, particularly in ICT. And their dearth or absence results in exclusion from global innovation networks. Okay? So again, this kind of strategic coupling or disarticulation in this case. Okay, now, this is going to be the challenging slide. We can also think of thin integration operating at a firm level. So we draw a distinction between information and knowledge. Information being discrete, non-codified bits of information which are time sensitive, so things around price of a sofa or whatever it may be. It may be different tomorrow than it was today, right? That's a piece of information. As opposed to knowledge capture, processing, transformation, deep integration into the knowledge economy. Now, some of the firms that we interviewed did do things in South Africa at least, like email furniture designs for computer numerically controlled cutting machines to cut out for them. So there were a few companies that did things like that. And we found there was another company I interviewed that had exported these big kind of silver tree holders to casinos in Las Vegas. Little South African company, you wouldn't think that they would do that. But they had found them on the web. And the only reason they said they were able to do that was the American casinos and hotels gave full upfront payment. They said something that would never happen in South Africa. It was the business institutions that were developed in the US which they kind of exported, which allowed that transaction to happen. Okay, but rare to have that kind of impact. Generally, these ICTs are not used for those kinds of things. Okay. So if we just focus in on the Durban wood product sector, these are the summary results of the survey that we did there. So you can see the average age of the companies, 15 years, average number of employees, 31, spending about 3 hours a day, the managers on ICTs of one shape or form. Percentage who export, 28%, mostly to regional markets. Of those who export, percentage of output, less than 10%. So exports, not important. Well, they're important, 10% is not insignificant. But certainly we saw this kind of introversion of the economy. That is that as the middle class has grown in South Africa, and as cheap flat pack furniture has become freely available from China, the growth markets are around customized furniture for the middle class. So income inequality structures the pattern of demand, which in turn is reflected back into the production structures. Percentage noting an improvement in productivity from ICTs, 34%. Okay, so there's some productivity improvement. You can do things quicker, but not massive. Some noted a reduction in productivity. So we had people saying only a couple of percent, so much less than noting an improvement. But we had people saying, you know, it drives me crazy, I leave my mobile phone in my drawer, or I switch it off, or customers are always trying to get me when I'm trying to do other stuff. 42% used it to look for new designs, primarily new furniture designs from China. But the biggest use was this one here, percentage who manage labor with ICTs. So again, this is a kind of counterintuitive result, right? The primary usage for mobile phones in particular is as a local labor control technology, not as a technology of globalization. We spoke to, or we interviewed one manager in a furniture factory, and he had an iPhone. He had cameras installed all around the factory. And so irrespective of where he was, he could check these cameras on his iPhone. He could call his workers, they had mobile phones, say, get back to work, you know, stop talking. So it had the effect of firming of place for labor and a kind of liquefaction of space for capital. Okay? So again, feeding into processes of neoliberalization. Okay, percentage using it to connect to new market buyers or customers, about 40%. This is one of the other things about the literature. There's a fallacy of composition at play in much of the literature. So let's say I'm an ICT enabled, or I own an ICT enabled company, I'm able to capture market share. I'm taking that business away from another company. I'm not necessarily growing the overall economy. So there's this kind of musical chairs or fallacy of composition at play, right? It's not expanding the economy. All it's doing is it's shifting the chairs around, if you like, the poverty chairs around in this scenario. Okay. So what are the implications in terms of these different levels at the firm, industrial regime, global production network? The technologies are extensively used. Most businesses have mobile phones. Many of them use LinkedIn and Skype and other programs on ICTs, okay? But they're absorbed in existing routines. they're absorbed into the pre-existing ways in which the businesses run, rather than generating new process and product innovations which can drive economic transformation. Sometimes contradictory impacts on time management, I've mentioned. They facilitate imports and exert intense competitive pressure on local firms. So this is a quote from one of the manufacturers. If a lodge in Africa has enough lead time, they'd rather get furniture made in China. Good quality stuff. Right? So the cost advantages that China is able to muster through its active exchange rate management, plus export rebates, plus a whole host of other industrial policy instruments, means it's very, very difficult for African manufacturers to compete in tradable goods sectors, and that's where we see this narrowing of focus onto the more non-tradable, customized furniture segments. And I'll show you a few photos of that. I mentioned that already. So overall, 10% in the Durban case, exporting, global production network, non-integration. Okay? And in fact, most of those exports are regional exports to Congo or to other countries in the Southern African region, rather than being part of this dynamic network trade that World Bank reports talk about. Or inward integration, that is imports coming in from China, Vietnam, and other places. Now, one of the other tropes, if you like, in the literature is that ICTs facilitate disintermediation. They facilitate empowerment by enabling value capture by small businesses, by cutting out middle men and women and allowing them to market directly to the final consumers or customers. But is that the case in the sectors that we were looking at? Well, no is the short answer to that. That in a context of very high unemployment, driven in part by the structural adjustment kinds of neoliberal economic policies that Tanzania has pursued for the last 25 plus years, you find the madalali, street brokers, are still playing this incredibly important role in structuring traffic to the furniture manufacturers and stores in Tanzania. Okay? So it hasn't led to disintermediation. When you talk to people about this, they say there's been an increase in this, the managers in this phenomenon. Okay? The inequality, which is a feature of neoliberalism, also results in changes to product markets. So this is an example of this kind of customized high-end furniture, right? So in a sense, the kind of Africa Rising discourse and the Africa as basket case discourse, right? They're both capturing part of the story of neoliberal, or what's been called Afro-neoliberal capitalism, right? And we see this played out in the sectors that we studied as well. Some photos from Durban, so you can see, you know, these very nice bars, kitchen units, couches and tables and so on. And when we spoke to people, they said, well, they want to be able to come and see this item being made. It's for a particular corner of their house. The dimensions have to be exactly right and so on. So there's no way you can import something like that from China. Right? It has to be custom made to your specific designs. And this offers a level of natural protection for those market segments. Okay, let's talk for a few minutes about the other case study sector, subsector, tourism. Again, probably no big surprise here. It's one of the biggest industries in the world. And again, because of growing global income inequality, one of the fastest growing in the world. Contributes about 3.3% of GDP in Africa and about 2.5% of employment. So that's telling you that it is relatively capital intensive. Okay, there's less employment relative to its share of GDP than you might expect. In the Western Cape in South Africa, about 10%, so the area around Cape Town, about 10% of the workforce is in tourism. So very important, and has been growing rapidly in Africa until, it seems, recently. Because what has happened recently that it might affect tourism? Oh, Ebola. So people are not buying holidays to South Africa, even though it's thousands upon thousands of miles away from Guinea and Sierra Leone. You know, they're not going to Spain, but they are not going to South Africa because Africa has Ebola. So anyway, I'm getting a bit sidetracked. Okay, just some photos of Cape Town. So you can see these are kind of middle income areas, I guess. Okay, and then you see the very ritzy 5-star tourist hotels. You know, all the bells and whistles, the tours, poverty tourism, and all the rest of it. You can do the township tours and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, if we're thinking about this theoretically, we say that there has been an exclusionary bias in the economic geography literature when we're thinking about tourism. So all of the focus in the past decade or so has been on these global production networks, which are fundamentally about manufacturing. Tourism hasn't really been studied very much from a kind of economic geography perspective, at least. So there's an exclusionary bias because it doesn't fit the global production network framework. And that's partly because tourism is characterized by value webs rather than chains. And it's characterized by value webs because what's produced in tourism is the experience. It's the touristic experience and the memories and affect and emotion and feeling, which is the product. And it's generated by the interaction of the local environmental context plus the surrounding people and the service providers and so on. Now, if we're thinking about impacts of ICTs, we know that they're an inverse or distributed infrastructure. This is why they have diffused so quickly. They're relatively cheap. Mobile phones anyway can be. They travel with the user in contrast to other infrastructures. And we argued that they synergize with extant capabilities so that if you're a successful firm, if you get access to ICT, you can leverage or synergize with these new technologies to further boost market share or whatever. But they also allow for the creation of new capabilities. So some of the micro entrepreneurs that we interviewed said things like, without mobile phones, we'd be starving. So they were aware that these were very important technologies for them to connect to customers, for example. There's still that fallacy of composition problem that I mentioned to you previously. Disintermediation in tourism. Well, this is a quote from tourism destination organization. Tourists are becoming more informed and cleverer, doing their own bookings rather than via tour operators. Again, no surprise, when we're booking our travel now, we go on to booking.com or Expedia oftentimes, or whatever it is. Right? But we had people say to us, some of these guest house owners, saying, we wish we could go back to when we would get a letter from Birmingham saying we will come for 3 weeks in such and such a month, right? Because that was a direct relationship with the customer. They said now they're in a whole different world where we have neo-intermediation by these big websites. Okay. And what kinds of commissions do these websites charge? Well, Viator, which is one of the biggest ones globally out of Las Vegas in the United States, charges a 25% commission. So when you take a tour in Cape Town, you pay 25%. So that commission, that money immediately leaves the economy. Local tour operators get pushed out of business, right, because of this. And we asked people about this, and they said, well, it's because people trust the big websites. They trust booking.com. They may look at our hotel web or guest house website, but they won't book directly with us because they don't want to send their bank details to us, whereas they will trust a big foreign-owned website. And this results then in oligopolization. Far from disintermediation and the creation of better functioning free market economies, it results in oligopolization and surplus extraction, replicating previous patterns of extractive globalization characteristic of much of Africa's incorporation into the global economy. Some people as well said that there's kind of malfeasance. Some of these websites can be manipulated. So this is one of the tour operators said, I know some Cape Town operators have public relations companies who produce content for them on TripAdvisor. It's very clear what they're doing and it's so false. So you employ people to write reviews for you and boost you up the rankings and capture business that way. Okay? All right. There's also a phenomenon of, in this virtual accumulation, of ratcheting. So that is, if you want to come up on that first page of booking.com and people to book with you, you have to pay a higher commission. So what will this do? It'll again encourage concentration of capital in the sector, centralization of capital, concentration and centralization of capital in the sector. I love this quote from a guest house, a boutique hotel owner that we interviewed. He said, you can't negotiate with Expedia, you just do as you're told. So it's creating this new kind of placeless power. I came up with this term, our book referees didn't like it, so it's not in the book, but kind of virtue real accumulation, where you have these websites extracting surplus virtually from real processes of, accommodation provision and so on the ground. So again, replicating previous patterns of economic extroversion, and also feeding into this coring of spaces, right? So there's a strategic coupling between particular locales and the kind of global imaginary produced through these big websites. So there's this kind of core space, and you have in central Cape Town, street children are excluded from the downtown now. There's CCTVs. And so again, replicating, some people talk about neo-apartheid in South Africa. Deeply classed, facilitated through new information, communication and surveillance technologies in that case. There's some technological development and innovation. One of the software programs that many of the companies used was one called Knightsbridge, which was developed in South Africa. It's a front office reservation and management system. So again, because South Africa has a relatively more developed economy, you do see some of this innovation happening there technologically, but fairly limited. Okay. Now, one of the economic consultants I talked to, she said, for small and medium-sized enterprises, the cost of internet access can be prohibitive, particularly if they're trying to do anything that is data heavy. So again, these economic constraints come into play. Right? It's not just about universal access, effortless kind of obliteration of geography and social and economic constraints. At the same time, another tourism manager said to me, it's absolutely evident that those who are exposed on the web are the ones doing business. So again, you have to have a web presence. And you have people saying sometimes interesting things like, we're on the web, but we're not on the web. So that was a halal guest house. They said, we don't have our own website, but we're people talk about us so much on these other websites that we have a web presence. So you got, again, these kind of interesting contradictions at play sometimes as well. ICT's ground in terms of their usage in real places and spaces. So people talked about laptop thefts or cable thefts, cutting out internet access. There was one business which was using a technique called ant colony optimization. Has anybody heard of that before? Ant colony, okay. So ants, they lay down, I think it's pheromones, right? And once one ant finds the food, then it lays down a trail and the other ants are able to follow that trail to the food, okay? And there's a technique you can use when you're designing your website to channel traffic to your website called ant colony optimization, working on a similar kind of principle, right? And it's about having certain kinds of keywords and things that will be picked up and so on. But this company, so even though it was very conscious of this kind of quite specific, technologically savvy marketing technique, they said they only employed people working less than 60 hours a month, because they didn't want to get involved in pay-as-you-earn taxes and all of that blank. Okay, so you can see how the kind of cheap labor economy is also articulated with this more technological side of the business, right? But the two are kind of interconstitutive, and it's one of the things that makes South Africa an affordable and arguably attractive tourist destination, or Cape Town at least anyway. People talked about wanting to create dreams for the tourists. You know, we want them to have this fantastic life experience, and that was what they were there to do, but built on this low-wage economy. Okay. So, what are the main take-homes? I gave this talk in Manchester the week before last, and someone said to me, "It's very depressing. Do you not have a responsibility as an academic to give hope?" That kind of flabbergasted me. But anyway, so our conclusions, and despite the tenor and tone maybe of the talk, I'm actually quite positive about the impacts of information and communication technologies. But I also think we need to be realistic about what they can and they can't do, what the structural implications are for economic development, and how they can be effectively used in conjunction with macroeconomic and industrial strategy as part of that to facilitate economic transformation. So I don't want to give a totally negative, kind of pessimistic conclusion here, but I'm going to go to that anyway. Okay. So the main things we saw were reinforcement of technological dependence through imports of new information and communication technologies, facilitation of deeper import penetration into African economies, from China in particular, the development of this hybrid mode of capital accumulation, in tourism at least dominated by international web-based firms, so the reinforcement of these patterns of extroversion which have been characteristic of the adverse differential incorporation of the continent into the global economy over the last couple of hundred years. So I'll leave it there and take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Park. So we have about 20 minutes or so for questions. I'm going to be cheeky and ask the first one.
Okay.
So, well, thanks again.
Sure.
I thought this was super helpful in sort of letting us think through how to tackle some of these more established conventional tropes in ICT and development. And I also really liked how you laid out these various processes of economic extroversion that are, in essence, amplified by ICTs. I guess what I'm keen to think through is what we do with this now, right? So I don't mean to sort of revisit your Manchester nightmare. And I also don't mean to kind of reproduce this what you might think of as like a neoliberal ontology of there is no alternative. But what is the alternative? To me, it seems like we need to go back to what you were talking about in the beginning, thinking through this imminent rather than imminent development. That ICTs are neither the cause nor the solution here. They're an amplifier, right? And it seems to me that you're encouraging us to think through, think about processes of global capitalism. If we want to think about things like uneven development and inequality. But if that's the case, that's something I fully endorse, but is that all we can do with ICTs? So is that all we can do with ICTs as a tool of either imminent or imminent development?
No, it's not. So we have focused on economic sectors, and we haven't dealt with the social service provision, health, education, all of that kind of stuff. So, and I'm not an expert on that, but it seems like there are very useful applications. But I guess if you're thinking about theories of poverty, right, that feeds into the palliative theory of poverty, which is that poverty exists, it's extant, and you have to mop it up, clean it up, because it's there, okay? And you can do that using ICTs. And I don't have a problem with that. I actually think there's a role for that. But if you adopt a structuralist or structural conception of poverty, you ask, how is it that poverty is produced? How is it, what are the socioeconomic structures which produce poverty, inequality, and marginalization? And then how do you need to reconfigure or do away with those social structures so that you don't have to mop up the poverty which is being produced? So, and there isn't this, it's kind of a heuristic to say that there's an imminent and an immanent development, right? That these things kind of interpenetrate. But I think what you can do is you can use them for social purposes. People use them because they find them useful, so that's why they've diffused so quickly. So in a sense, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, in that sense. But then, as I was saying towards the end there, you need to have an integrated economic development strategy of which ICT and broader science and technology policy are a piece. So information and communication so let's take the example of inward and outward GPNs. So rather than saying, once everybody has mobile phones or internet access, problem solved, you can connect to global markets, the question, I'd ask a different question is, what capabilities, what technology, what institutions do you need to foster strategic couplings with global production networks, and what role can information and communication technology play in that? And then the final angle of attack I would take on this is that if you're thinking about the ICT value chain, again, you would think strategically about what segments or nodes of that value chain could you conceivably, realistically create a competitive advantage in, and then try and foster that, again, within the broader context of kind of industrial and trade policy. So I think that would be my answer to that. So it's not, as I say, this kind of merchant of doom, and ICTs are certainly there, and people use them because they find it useful. It's not a kind of Luddite argument either that we don't need ICTs or that ICTs are all bad, but it's the kind of overdetermination of the impact of ICTs which we take issue with.
Thanks.
Yeah. You, Cherry?
Sure. Maybe let's take two or three at a time. So I see three hands right here. 1, 2, 3.
Hi, I'm Malin Fiddler, and my research right now focuses on the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection Convention. I don't know if you've looked at this at all, but I'd be curious what your thoughts are on why that convention was put in place and what effects it might have for SMEs.
I have no idea.
Okay. Well, that's good for me. My research is good.
Yes, I want to ask about the dynamics of appropriation of the technology into these firms.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent is the things you've seen just what you'd have seen 20 years ago in Northern Ireland, where people didn't really know how to use the technologies and so hadn't changed the way they did their businesses?
Mm.
Or is it that it's already changed in the rest of the world and you're trying to catch up?
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there some way, is there anything when you were looking at different between different firms where some were appropriating it better
Mhm.
to their businesses than others?
Sure.
Shall we take
Oh, yeah,
the
sure.
first
Okay.
question?
Just two questions on.
Yeah.
The first is just an assumption about small and medium enterprise as an engine of growth.
Yeah.
So that people like Mazzucato would say innovation in any country
Uh-huh.
is about deep investment and not small and medium enterprises, which are much more survivalist and exploitative. The second question would be, much of what you said doesn't leave room for distinctive patterns of African exploitation or North-South discourse. So a lot of the logic of cultural extraction and the expanding exploitation of individuals, that whole logic seems to me to be having much more dramatic relative impact in the West. So books like, Will Standing on the Precariat and so on. It's a lot easier to exploit what used to be the Western class-oriented, trade unionized workforce because of these technological mechanisms than it is to hyper-exploit already exploited Africans. So I'm just thinking that the net effect of what you're saying, and this is a perhaps more pessimistic point, the net effect of what you're saying is that everybody's more universally screwed, not that Africa is particularly screwed. And the third point then is, I'm wondering about how you build a distinctive case for the impact of technology in Africa, because I didn't begin to hear that.
Okay. Big questions. I would disagree with you about small and medium-sized enterprises because, first of all, if you're thinking about the process of economic development, right, if you look at what subsectors most late industrializing countries have initially established their competitive advantage in, it has been in relatively low skill, low tech kinds of industries like textile and clothing, like assembly, right? And certainly that's been the pattern in Southeast Asia and East Asia, okay? Because you can't leapfrog into high tech, research intensive production immediately. You have to develop your capabilities, you have to generate rents and capture them and reinvest them in technological development. So I'm not saying that transnational companies or global production networks and value chains don't have a role to play in this, but it's about how you synergize the interactions between different scales to facilitate strategic couplings. And also, if you look even at an economy like the United States, the world's foremost knowledge economy, right, where they invest whatever it is, 3 or 4% of GDP in R&D a year, what generates most of the jobs in the United States? It's small and medium-sized enterprises. So I don't agree with that, and I don't agree that you can leapfrog into, as I said, high-tech, R&D intensive kinds of activities immediately. In terms of the hyper-exploitation, and can you squeeze more surplus out of people who are already exploited? I mean, in a sense, I agree with you maybe around that, but what was it, Joan Robinson said, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. So one of the things, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but one of the things that we see is non-integration, right? So it's people not having jobs, rising levels of unemployment, rather than the nature of the exploitation in the labour relation, which is a big part of the picture. And then a theory of, what your final question is about, a theory of knowledge.
Well, so what is the distinctive impact
Yeah.
of, in other words, a distinctive line of thought about what technology is doing in Africa? So if it's about hyper-exploitation,
Yeah.
we can argue about how much surplus there is left to extract there relative to what technology is doing to hotels through Airbnb, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that seems to me a bigger relative
Sure.
challenge for the West than Africa.
Okay.
So if you want to return to the sort of 60s Beckford, how Europe in underdeveloped Africa thing, and make the argument that technology is exacerbating these things, which would be the rhetoric, how would you make that substantive case?
So,
How is Africa getting more screwed relatively still?
well, I think what we're seeing is a replication of previous patterns of extractive globalization. I mean, that's what we're seeing from our study and our interviews with the firms. So you're seeing things like these big websites extracting commissions, you're seeing imports coming in from China, you're not seeing the development of endogenous economic growth. So in terms of a theory of technological impacts, I think what we argue in the book is that these technologies, not in terms of the companies we studied, but more broadly, are primarily used for social purposes. They're used to connect with family and friends and to keep those bonds and strengthen those bonds and social ties, and they're used for security purposes. So they're socially articulating, but not economically articulating into global production networks for the most part.
One line punchline.
Yeah.
Your third point cannibalizes your first one. So Samsung came straight out of Korea, not as a small and medium enterprise. There are all kinds of brands that you haven't heard of in China yet are now biting Samsung's butt.
Yeah.
These aren't small and medium enterprises.
Where did Samsung start? Where did Samsung start?
Korea.
Yeah, but it started in a garage, didn't it?
Well, so did Facebook.
Yes.
I mean, so did
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah, but it
It's
didn't
not
come
small.
straight. Yeah, okay, but whether it came straight out of Korea or not is how it globalizes is a different question. Samsung began as a small business, and it grew through a facilitative economic environment where the South Korean government was able to leverage the opportunities for domestic market growth, import substitution, and exports through a very sophisticated industrial strategy and regime. So the chaebol in South Korea were given access to subsidized credit. There were all sorts of prohibitions on what you could and couldn't do. South Korea had the death penalty for offshoring foreign exchange. That's how seriously South Korea took its economic strategy, because it was a matter of national security and economic survival. So even if in the initial stages of economic development, companies don't come straight out of anywhere. They grow and they develop capabilities. So it's not that I'm kind of positing this kind of Smithian economy of small enterprises always and forever. But what I'm saying is that if you're going to build, the evidence to date has been that transnational corporations, at least in their investments in Africa, have not engaged in structurally transformative kinds of investment. And that, given that, the continent has not been able to attract the same kinds of industries that Southeast Asia has, that there should be a focus on endogenous development and the development of the capabilities of small and medium-sized enterprises.
Shall we take a few questions from this
Hasn't
side of
answered
the
my
room?
question yet.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Can you remind me?
Dynamics.
Yeah.
You know, it's,
Oh, right.
you know,
Yeah.
is there any sign that these technologies are being embodied in institutions, or the way firms work, or finding new ways of doing things,
Yes.
as opposed to being trapped?
Sure. So this is kind of the, is it too early to say question. Maybe firms will adapt and use these things differently through time. And that may be the case to some degree, and we can't say, it's a counterfactual, we can't say what will come in the future. But what we can say is that the companies that were using these technologies in more sophisticated ways tended to be white-owned. They tended to have access to cheaper capital. They tended to be somewhat bigger. They tended to have social networks to already be exporting. So we had some of the companies tracking inputs coming from Asia, for example, using GPS, so on the tankers and so on, they could tell when their wicker was getting in or whatever it was. So some of the companies were using these technologies in quite sophisticated ways. So you see this kind of bifurcation at play. So again, I can't really speculate, but what I would say is this, is in terms of mobile telephony, it's very difficult to see how this by itself can contribute to product or process innovation, okay? Unless people start using smartphones to access the internet, and that's how most of the internet is accessed in Africa, right? But it's not clear to me that that would be one of the primary channels through which firms would be able to leverage process and product innovation, precisely because it's an endogenous process. You can get ideas from elsewhere. You can adapt social technologies and management systems from elsewhere, and you can copy other technologies. And that is, in a sense, maybe a type of innovation. So you might see some of that happening.
So you don't have local networks of people learning from each other at all, like you get in some of our...
Well, there were some great quotes. We have some of them in the book, where one of the owner who was talking about not wanting to employ people outside of casualized labor contracts said, oh, they're living back in the 19th century, you know, out in the boonies in South Africa. And there's a very racialized discourse, they're backward. But then a few sentences later, talking about how she was being taught to use the mobile phone by these people that were supposedly living in the 19th century. So you know, there is innovation, or there's a lot of knowledge sharing that goes on, both from workers to businesses and between businesses, and they have clusters as well to try and get businesses to cooperate around issues which affect their productivity and exports, and ICT is part of that.
Take a few more questions. Nicholas, one hand there, and right there.
You talked a lot about in the introduction or rationale slides that often it's the cost of the technology that limits, poorer or disenfranchised people from making the most use of it.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of resonates with, things that World Bank would say or Internet.org would say, that you need to make this stuff available for free or for very cheap and sort of lower that burden. But then you also talked about this reinforcement of existing power structures and exploitation. And then you also talked about the opportunity cost of these investments, that you could also invest in others. So as concrete policy advice, increase affordability, lower prices, give everyone the internet, great thing, policymakers should do that, invest in that, or you will reinforce these things to actually steer away from that. If
Right.
you don't integrate it systemically, there's no point.
Okay, so we have some statistics in the book, and Richard Heeks in Manchester is one of the experts on this, and he looks at the failure rates for ICT4D projects by the World Bank's own statistics, their evaluation unit, and they're 70, 80, 90% failure rates. And yet there's huge amounts of money being pumped into these things. what's the political economy of this? What other sector, we don't have agriculture for development, we don't have industry for development, what other sector would attract this kind of investment and all of this buzz in academia and policy institutions and the media around this? What's the political economy of that? What we argue in the book is that it's because the ICT 4D movement is one of the most powerful social movements in the world. And it brings together major transnational corporations like Google, like Facebook, which has all sorts of initiatives to beam the internet for free, and Facebook Zero, so people can still be consumerized in Africa. Even if they can't afford mobile phone credit, they can still see the ads on Facebook. Right? So it's again this kind of bottom of the pyramid penetrating even the lowest market segments, right? So I would start from a different point. I don't think, yeah, it's great to have free internet access or reduce the cost of phone calls, fine, no problem. But there is if it's a question of doing that versus doing something else, you have to have a planning process and you have to have a cost-benefit analysis around this. It's not just let's invest money in ICTs for the sake of it because they're this incredible technology and we'll take it on faith that they have economic and socially transformative aspects to them, right? Even Bill Gates said, he said, money would be better invested in vaccinations and in primary healthcare and those kinds of things if you're trying to alleviate poverty rather than in free internet access, right? So what I'm saying is, if you want to have, rather than being caught up in the hype and bluster and techno-boosterism, you have to have a sound analytical strategy based on research and cost-benefit analysis. It's not rocket science to do that. Rather than being driven by the alliance of major transnational info capital, big Western countries which are heavily invested in promoting one of the only manufacturing sectors in which they still have a demonstrable competitive advantage, and the institutions like the World Bank and the NGO community who form the four kind of pillars of the ICT4D movement and give it its kind of motive, force and power in conjunction with the global media, think about it rationally and base your decisions on policies on evidence backed by sound empirical research and proper analytics.
So on that point, I would suggest that perhaps this sort of new literature is a bit like the modernisation literature of the 50s and 60s that saw importing capital into Africa as a solution, and you just need sort of Western, have your sort of Rosto growth model. And I was wondering, I presume you'd be very sceptical about, therefore, countries like Rwanda, which have this sort of ICT sector. Are we going to, in 2020, be like a middle-income country by having Kigali as their capital, as a sort of ICT hub for the region, when you have the majority of people in very big rural poverty? But I was also wondering about which you sort of hinted at, the role of other sort of South BRIC development partners in creating this ICT boom in Africa, which I know you've written about a bit elsewhere, and how that sort of complicates the sort of South-South cooperation label.
Mm-hmm. So I think Rwanda is a very interesting case, and we have our master's program, we have collaboration with them. So to me, there are a few social developmental states in Africa, and Rwanda is one of them. So if you look at what Rwanda has accomplished, or Ethiopia, in terms of the reduction of hunger, in terms of improving life expectancy, reducing maternal mortality, many of the social indicators, you see big, big improvements, right? And that's because they have rolled out many of the kind of palliative approaches to, and also some land reform and a whole variety of other things, right? But they're not economically developmental states because they are blocked by the structure of the global trade and capital regimes. So they haven't succeeded in structural diversification of their economies because of the lock-in of economic extroversion, which has been accomplished through decades of neoliberalization plus World Trade Organization, so on and so forth, the kind of institutions and architecture of the global trade and capital regimes. In terms of the BRICS, myself and Sana were talking about this earlier, and I don't know, you guys may have opinions on this or may know more about this, but for me, what I'm seeing is a kind of homogenization of the global technological diffusionary regime, if I can put it in those terms. So that back 10, 15 years ago, you had satellites passing over computers in Africa and downloading health data every couple of days, right? Now with fiber optic cable, the internet has been kind of not rolled out everywhere, but it's widely accessible in many countries, right? So you're seeing this kind of homogenization in that way. So I think appropriate technology, what used to be appropriate technology, maybe is not that appropriate. But the other thing that's interesting about India in particular is they have something called the Very, Very Important People's Network in Africa, and who are VVIPs. VVIPs are heads of state, okay? And they have put in place this communication architecture so they can communicate with each other. And it's also used for some health applications. But this is part of a strategy because India is not able to compete with the range of power capabilities that China is able to bring to bear. So they directly are targeting political elites as gatekeepers of resources and market access. So because of their more limited power capabilities, they have to adopt a different strategy, and ICTs play a part in that.
I was just wondering, it seemed your study takes ICT development in Tanzania and South Africa as a kind of given, and you're looking at how these SMEs are using it or not. But I was wondering if there was any relationship between the SMEs and the states, sort of state provision of ICT or encouragement of various aspects of this operation. Did they ever mention it, or what was their attitude? Was there any difference between Tanzania and South Africa in that respect?
So I mean, one of the things again that gets talked about in the literature is the fact the relative absence of the state has provided a source of competitive advantage for private sector ICT providers. So I think Nigeria maximum had 500,000 landlines. Now there are tens upon tens of millions of people in Nigeria who have access to it. People talked about the state, at least in South Africa, more in negative terms. So they talked about Telkom, which is the company that the state has shares in, as being very inefficient, not coming out on time to do repairs, and those. So they were quite negative. Whereas in terms of the private sector providers, they were much more positive because obviously, their survival depends on it. They're more responsive to that, and costs have come down dramatically for text and voice. Some of the other interesting things we found were people were still using things like faxes sometimes. People get locked in. There's a kind of technological path dependence that achieves a kind of lock-in in some of these firms. So they're still using faxes or landlines. But then other people were using these routers. So you put it on your landline, and then when you're calling a mobile phone, it thinks it's another mobile phone, so the call is cheaper rather than calling. So there are all of these kind of workarounds that are deployed as well.
I was going to ask us to wrap up, but I saw someone here who was eager. Oh, you're not eager to ask a question. Okay, so what, if there's any more questions or comments, we'll be right outside. There's some wine there that you're all invited to join us with. But before we do that, let's say thanks one more time.
Thank you.